2023 is an election year for Nigeria. And every candidate is trying to figure out how to get votes from as many eligible Nigerians as possible. But it's clear that one set of Nigerians will be excluded from voting, and that's Nigerians living in the diaspora. As of 2017, there are over 1.7 million Nigerians living in other countries. As of now, diasporans are not allowed to vote in Nigeria's elections. In this episode, we ask what would happen if we allow them to vote. According to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, 88 countries allow out-of-country participation in presidential elections. The eligibility requirements for out-of-country voting are different, depending on the country. Some countries are a bit restrictive and allow out-of-country voting only for citizens who are out of the country in official capacity, like diplomats, public officials, and military personnel. For some other countries, any category of citizens abroad, students, refugees, workers, they all can get to vote. For some, they allow out-of-country voting only if the citizens are out of the country temporarily, while others still allow citizens to vote even if they leave the country permanently. For countries that practice out-of-country voting, there are 4 basic options on how they carry it out: in-person voting, postal voting, proxy voting, and internet voting. For in-person voting, the voter has to go to a specific place to cast their vote in person. This can be a diplomatic mission or a polling place specially set up abroad. Because this method requires advanced preparation, it takes place some days or weeks before election day. In-person voting is the procedure most widely used for diaspora voting. International IDEA reports that it is used by 109 states and territories, including Brazil, Egypt, Finland, and South Africa. Then there's postal voting, where ballot papers are usually sent by postal mail to the voter. When the voter has marked the paper, they return it to special counting locations or hand deliver it to a post office, along with some form of certification to verify their identity. Sometimes witnesses are required to confirm the identity of the voter and witness that they have filled in the ballot paper freely and without interference. This voting method is used by 50 states, including Austria, Canada, and Papua New Guinea. For proxy voting, a citizen living or staying abroad will choose a proxy, that's someone already registered to vote in their home country, and this proxy will help them cast their votes in the country. Proxy voting is used by 21 states, such as Belgium, Belize, Mauritius, and Vanuatu. Finally, there is internet voting. This has to do with some form of web-based voting system set up by the country. Now, at first, this method was gaining ground for out-of-country voting in national elections, but recent trends indicate a reversal. Some countries stopped using internet voting due to heightened risks of cyber attacks and foreign interference in elections. The arguments for or against diaspora voting has always centered around the same subjects. Those who are against diaspora voting have argued that diaspora voting gives citizens who don't live in the country undue influence over the country's national politics and development. And they argue that citizens living abroad, especially those who have been away for extended periods or even permanently, would not necessarily be affected by political decisions and policies on education, construction, and so on. So why should they have a say? They also argue that these citizens pay little to no tax, and so don't really add anything to the country. Those who argue for diaspora voting insist that they still have a significant economic impact on their home country. According to a 2019 report by Pew Research Center, Nigeria accounts for over a third of migrant remittance flows to sub-Saharan Africa. The issue of diaspora and out-of-country voting features in international and regional treaties, but there is no international norm that forces states to enfranchise citizens living abroad. It's up to the countries. Now, when a nation has decided to allow its diaspora to vote, there are 4 major considerations to make. 1. The Electoral Management Board, which in our case would be INEC, along with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will need to inform voters about the voting process. Regardless of which method the country has chosen, voter information materials such as posters, newspaper advertisements, and internet or social media engagements need to be produced to inform citizens abroad about the entire process to vote in elections. For example, in Tunisia's 2011 elections, almost 1/3 of the estimated 720,000 Tunisians living abroad were able to vote. About 60% of Tunisian voters from abroad were residing in France. So Tunisia's Electoral Management Board had to establish around 100 polling stations across France in diplomatic and consular missions. Another thing INEC will need to consider is securely shipping and receiving the sensitive election materials. Transporting election materials for in-person and postal voting needs careful consideration, as equipment like registration forms and ballots need to get to the right place before the registration process and before voting on election day. And of course, these ballots must be secured. International IDEA reports that during Indonesia's 2019 general election, it was discovered that tens of thousands of postal ballots had been intercepted by vote riggers. Then INEC has to consider the voting and counting process. How would the voting be done? In Nigeria, the presidential candidate with the most votes is declared the winner as long as he gains at least 25% of the votes in 2/3 of Nigeria's 36 states. Will those in diaspora be required to fill in their states and constituencies as if they are voting from home? After voting, how would INEC ensure that the ballots cast return in good time to be counted with ordinary votes? In Thailand's 2019 general election, some 1,500 ballots from voters in New Zealand were not counted because they arrived at the Election Management Board headquarters too late. INEC will also have to consider the financial costs of diaspora voting. From developing the regulations and manuals for the process, to employing and training staff, to design and the production of materials, and to providing security for staff and materials for the election. It's not just the cost to INEC, but diaspora voting opens up additional costs for campaigns. So if Nigeria decides to allow diaspora voting, which of the 4 methods would work for us? Postal voting is usually considered to be less expensive when compared to in-person voting, mostly because it requires less staff and no physical polling units. The main cost with postal voting is securely delivering and retrieving the ballot papers, especially when postal services cannot be relied on and the country now has to use international courier services. Internet voting has a high startup cost because the country would need to invest in technology, as the system has to be easy to use, yet secure and transparent. Estonia has had an internet voting system in place since 2007. International IDEA recommends that before choosing this high-tech system, the country has to consider one thing. Will stakeholders trust the results of a vote that takes place using machines and cables, or are ballot papers still needed to ensure a legitimate outcome? Proxy voting is likely the cheapest because it mostly only requires the Electoral Management Board to provide a form that says the diaspora voter has transferred their votes to the person they trust. INEC also has to consider whether it will allow diasporans in all countries to vote or only in select countries. It will be difficult and very expensive to establish diaspora voting in every single country, and as such, INEC needs to set criteria for choosing which countries will be allowed to vote. For example, Senegal requires at least 500 voters to register with a diplomatic mission in a given host country before the Electoral Management Board can establish an out-of-country polling station. Now, let's assume that INEC has thought through all the technical issues and they are ready to do it. We have to make it legal first. And this is where politics comes in. Our National Assembly, that's the Senate and House of Representatives, would need to amend Section 77, subsection 2 of the 1999 Constitution as amended. This section currently restricts registration and voting to persons residing in Nigeria only. And they would also need to amend the Electoral Act to accommodate this new voting category. When we add up all the requirements needed to allow diaspora voting, the political will to amend our laws, managing the risks involved, the planning required, and of course, cost implications. Are we ready? How long will it take us to be?